If you look around, you'll see that women's sports are having a moment, right? We've all heard that. And to a degree, it's true. Revenues in women's elite sports are up 340% since 2022. The WNBA has a new multi-billion, with a B, dollar broadcast deal. There's new leagues, new franchises, new stadiums. In some sports, things are genuinely moving. But I want to push back on the word moment. Because if you look a little harder, what you actually see is that women's sports is having a moment in some corners. And in others, the moment hasn't arrived at all. In my last episode, we talked to Alexa Brabeck from the U.S. Women's Nordic Combined team. Women's Nordic Combined has never been allowed to compete in the Olympics. Men have been competing in the sport since it started 102 years ago. This summer, maybe as soon as the next few days or weeks, the International Olympic Committee will vote on whether to include women in the sport in the 2030 Games in France. This isn't the first time the IOC has voted on this. In recent years, they've laid out various criteria the women athletes have to meet in order to be considered. These included creating a World Cup circuit, having diversity in the number of nations participating, increasing their viewership. The list goes on. The women have done all of those things, by the way, and more. They have support from outsiders, politicians, even their own male colleagues. And each time, the IOC comes back and says no. Why? What reason could they have for denying fully capable women who already compete at an elite level? And why are these women, as well as other pockets, still fighting to be taken seriously in sports in 2026, while other sports seemingly flourish with women's leagues and female athletes? I went looking for the answer. And what I found is that there's a really cold truth running underneath all of the stories we're hearing right now. Underneath every story about women being let in or kept out, every door that opened and every one that didn't. And it's been that in sports for about 130 years, just dressed up differently depending on the decade. I'm not going to tell you what I found, not yet. Instead, I'm going to walk you through 5 stories. Maybe by the end, you'll see it. I think you will. And once you do, I'll be honest, you might not look at the women's sports moment the same way again. To understand where we're going, you need to know what the world looked like when this all started. It's the late 1800s. Women lacked control over their own property and wages and were largely excluded from things like higher education, voting, even being on a jury. And by this time, the prevailing medical consensus in Western Europe held that women had a finite amount of what was called, and I'm putting in quotes, vital energy. That energy was supposed to be reserved for reproduction. If a woman spent too much of that energy on physical exertion, she risked her fertility. Some doctors specifically warned that if a woman ran long distances, her uterus would fall out. Now, there is no scientific evidence for any of this. Women kept competing anyway, too. They competed through informal clubs, grassroots races, sports that existed outside of official channels because the official channels didn't want them. But that belief that women's bodies can't handle sports spread. It spread through medicine, through journalism, through the committees and governing bodies that were just then starting to organize international athletics. And by the early 1900s, it was accepted in most of the Western world that women were too fragile for serious athletic competition. Keep that in the back of your mind, because here is where it gets interesting. It's August 2nd, 1928, in the Olympic Stadium in Amsterdam. 9 women line up at the start of the 800-meter track race. It's the first time women have ever competed in a middle-distance track event at the Olympics. Up until this point, the longest race women had previously been allowed to run was the 100 meters. Men were already running the marathon in Olympic competition, by the way. The gun goes off. What happens next is one of the most remarkable performances in Olympic history, and almost nobody knows it. Lena Ratka of Germany wins the gold medal in 2 minutes, 16.8 seconds. It's a world record, and not by a little. She takes 7 seconds off of her own previous world record. In second place is Japan's Kinui Hitomi. In third, Sweden's Inga Gensel. By the time the final results are tallied, 6 of the 9 women who ran that race have broken that previous world record. And again, this is all in the first time women had ever been allowed to even run this distance at the Olympics. Here's what the newspapers said about the race the next morning. John Tunis, writing for the New York Evening Post, wrote, and I quote, "Below us on the cinder path were 11 wretched women, 5 of whom dropped out before the finish, while 5 collapsed after reaching the tape. Knute Rockne," yes, that Knute Rockne, the Notre Dame football coach, who was in Amsterdam as a correspondent, wrote in the Pittsburgh Press, "It was not a very edifying spectacle to see a group of fine girls running themselves into a state of exhaustion." The New York Times even reported that several women had to be carried off the track. Let's go through what was really true. There were 9 women in the race, not 11. All 9 finished. None were carried off. The winner set a world record. Film from the event, which existed because cameras existed in 1928 and it was being filmed, shows athletes bent over, catching their breath after running at a world record pace, which is what athletes look like after running at world record pace. It's also what male runners look like, but nobody wrote editorials about that. The International Olympic Committee, citing the media coverage, voted to remove the women's 800 meters from the Olympic program. But this wasn't after the games. This was while the games were still happening. They didn't wait. They didn't investigate. They didn't even have a representative at the race. As far as we know, they didn't look at the film. They just read the newspapers and made a decision. And because of that move, the women's 800 meters did not return to the Olympics until 1960, 32 years later, because of a false story told by men who were there, who saw what happened, and who wrote something different. And because a committee found the story convenient. Now ask yourself, why would a journalist lie about that? Why would a famous football coach misreport what he saw? Part of it was probably genuine discomfort. These were men who had probably never seen women compete at this level, and the sight of women exhausted after a race read to them as a catastrophe. But part of it was also something else. The late 1920s were a period of significant anxiety about women's roles in public life. They had just gotten the right to vote, they were entering the workforce more, they were running marathons unofficially, and showing up at Olympic trials. They were pushing at every door that was supposed to be closed. So reporting those women as collapsing probably wasn't an accident. What was it, though? File that away. Let's go over to Boston. It's April 1967, specifically the Boston Marathon. There's an image. You've seen it. I know you have. A woman in race number 261. A man in street clothes lunging at her, grabbing her, trying to rip the number off her chest. The woman is Catherine Switzer. The man is Jock Semple, the race co-director who has just jumped off an official's bus when he spotted that a woman had a bib number. He is screaming at her, "Get the hell out of my race." Her boyfriend, a former All-American football player, shoves Semple to the ground. Switzer keeps running. She finishes in 4 hours and 20 minutes. The photo runs around the world, and it becomes one of the most famous images in the history of women's sports. That's the story everyone knows. Here's what was really happening that day. While Catherine Switzer was getting attacked by an official 2 miles into the marathon, another woman was running the same course. Her name was Bobby Gibb. She'd hidden in the bushes near the start line, pulled on a hoodie, and slipped into the pack when the race began. Nobody attacked her. Nobody even really noticed her. Bobby Gibb finished the 1967 Boston Marathon in 3 hours, 27 minutes, almost an hour faster than Switzer. She was the first woman to cross the finish line that day. And it was actually the second year in a row she'd run the race. In 1966, she'd also run, unofficially, finishing in 3 hours and 21 minutes. The woman who won was invisible in several ways. She didn't have a bib number. The famous photograph didn't happen near her or involve her. Her presence didn't stand out. But because of the rules of not allowing women to race, her achievement also became invisible. It took the Boston Athletic Association until 1996, 30 years after Gibb first ran and won, to officially recognize her 3 consecutive victories. Her name is now on the Boston Marathon Memorial, and there's a statue of her at the starting line. But for 3 decades, the woman who ran faster than 2/3 of the men's field twice before anyone ever took a photograph was not part of the official record. She wasn't just excluded from the race, she was excluded from the record, and there's a difference. Now, here's the part of the Switzer story that I find most interesting. The Boston Marathon officially opened to women in 1972, but it wasn't because of a moral epiphany or because they genuinely believed women could have an impact or even handle the race. The cost of keeping women out had become visible. That image of a man attacking a woman on a public street during the race had gone the 1972 equivalent of viral, and it became a liability. The press, which had once supported the exclusion of women from the marathon, had turned on marathon officials. The public was watching, and the risk became too great, so women were allowed in. And Jock Semple, the man who became the face of everything wrong with how women had been treated, showed up at the 1973 Boston Marathon start line, walked up to Kathrine Switzer, put a kiss on her cheek, and took a picture with her. Now, Switzer has said she believes Semple was always just someone who loved the sport and wanted it to be great, and that his attack came from panic, not malice. They actually became close friends after the incident, and she said the friendship that followed was genuine. I think that's probably true, and I also think there's something important in it. Semple wasn't a villain. He was a gatekeeper who believed his job was to protect something. When the cost of that protection became too high, when the image became the story, and when the exclusion became the story, and not just a story, but an embarrassing story, then the gate opened. Notice that pattern. We're going to keep seeing it. Let's jump to March 2017. The U.S. women's national hockey team has just announced that they are boycotting the International Ice Hockey Federation World Championships over wage inequality and a lack of support from USA Hockey, the governing body of the sport in the U.S. To understand how significant this boycott was, you need to understand who these women were. Team USA was the #1 ranked women's hockey team in the world. They had medaled at every single Olympics since women's hockey became an Olympic sport in 1998. They'd won the World Championship 7 times in the past 16 years. Over that same period, the men's team had won 2 silvers. But they were, by any measure, one of the most successful national teams in American sports history. In turn, USA Hockey paid the women's national team a stipend of $6,000 per athlete. How often do you think they got paid that money? What do you think? Every month? Every year? Nope. They got it over a 4-year Olympic cycle. $6,000 for 4 years of being the best women's hockey players in the world. I did the math, and I think it works out to about $125 a month. The women weren't even asking for salaries equal to the men's team when they went on this boycott. Those players made millions in the NHL. They were just asking for a living wage, for travel arrangements equal to the men's program, for hotel rooms where they didn't have to share with teammates, for disability insurance, for more than 9 games a year in non-Olympic years, and for girls' development programs that matched what USA Hockey spent on boys' development programs. USA Hockey's response was to say that they'd been proactively increasing support for women for years and were disappointed by the players' decision. And then, behind the scenes, they started making calls to find replacement players. They tried college players, Division I, Division III. They tried rec league players. They tried high school players. Every single one turned them down. The entire pipeline of women's hockey in America stood with the national team. And here's the interesting part. USA Hockey eventually agreed to a 4-year contract. Salaries went to roughly $70,000 a year. They've got travel parity, insurance, development funding. They got most of what they were asking for. What we didn't know at the time, and what stayed quiet for over a year, was that the NHL had to secretly step in and provide $25,000 per player to help USA Hockey make the math work. So, did the door open for women in hockey? It sure looked like it did, at least from the outside. But behind the scenes, what really happened was USA Hockey had no intention of meeting the athlete demands until the reputational cost got too high. See? There's that pattern again. Finally, let's go to Park City, Utah. Lindsay Vann grew up there. She started ski jumping at age 7. By her mid-20s, she was one of the best ski jumpers in the world, male or female. Now, in 2010, the Winter Olympics came to Vancouver. The ski jumping venue was at Whistler. Lindsey Vann held the hill record at Whistler, the longest jump off that specific hill ever by anyone. She didn't just hold the women's record, she held the record, men included. She was not allowed to compete in the Olympics because she was a woman. Ski jumping had been an Olympic sport since 1924. It's one of the original Winter Olympic disciplines. Yet in 86 years, no woman had ever competed in it at the Games. The IOC's rationale had shifted over the decades. As late as 2005, they were saying that the sport seemed, and I quote, not appropriate for ladies from a medical point of view. The IOC also used more neutral language about technical criteria and not enough participating nations. Does that sound familiar? And also, side note, the medical argument was particularly impressive given that the IOC's own medical commission had published a report in 2002 stating clearly that female reproductive organs are better protected from athletic injury than male reproductive organs. So the IOC had their own data, their own proprietary data, and still said the sport wasn't appropriate for ladies. Anyway, Lindsey Vann and 14 other female ski jumpers sued the Vancouver Organizing Committee for gender discrimination. They won, in a way. The judge ruled that, yes, the IOC was discriminating against women. The judge said it very plainly. And then she said the Canadian courts couldn't order an international organization to change its event schedule. But here's where it gets really ironic. The judge wrote, and I quote, if the IOC had applied the criteria for admission of new events to both men's and women's ski jumping events, neither group would be competing in the 2010 Games. Did you get that? Men's ski jumping only survived because of tradition. By the IOC's own standards for inclusion, the standards they were citing to keep women out, the men's event wouldn't have qualified either. If you watch the Winter Olympics now, you'll see that women do ski jump. So what changed? The lawsuit helped, as did the international media coverage. Tens of thousands of people signed petitions. But what really changed was the optics of the quote-unquote most progressive modern Olympics, featuring a sport that had been open to men for 86 years and had never once let a woman jump. The cost of the exclusion started to climb. In 2011, the IOC announced that women's ski jumping would be included in the 2014 Sochi Games. And Lindsey Vann competed at those games. She was 29, but she'd spent most of her athletic prime fighting a committee. Her coach said at the Olympic announcement, they deserve a medal hung around their necks for what they've done for the sport. At the end of the day, it's not about medals. It took 86 years and a lawsuit and a mountain of public pressure for the IOC to let women jump. Now, I have one more example before we name that cold truth that's been running underneath. All the examples I've given so far are sports that were first created for and, frankly, dominated by men. And I think there's a version of what I've been saying that leads you to a place I don't want you to go. That version says men's sports have always had the money and the support, and women's sports have always been underfunded, and the sports designed around men are where the problem lives. That's not the whole truth. Because if you look at a sport like gymnastics, you'll see that doesn't fit. Gymnastics has been a dominantly women's sport for almost forever. They have massive youth participation, packed arenas. They're one of the highest viewed Olympic sports when the Olympic Games come on. Simone Biles. But here's the thing about gymnastics and figure skating and a handful of other sports. They were built around female athletes from the beginning. The infrastructure was always there. The sport was designed with women in mind. The training methodology was built for female bodies. The equipment was built for female bodies. The culture was built around the female competition. And yet, something has gotten in the way anyway. Simone Biles, I mentioned her. She is the most decorated gymnast in the history of the sport, male or female. She has 37 Olympic and World Championship medals. She has elements named after her. She is, probably by any objective measure, one of the greatest athletes alive, period. In 2003, she made a little over $7 million, and almost none of it came from gymnastics. Her national team stipend, or the official payment from USA Gymnastics for being the best gymnast on earth, was less than half of 1% of her annual earnings. The rest of the money came from Visa, United Airlines, MasterCard, speaking engagements. So even in the sport built entirely around women, the women at the top are not the ones deciding what their talent is worth. Someone else is making that call, and someone else is capturing that value. And it's all because of this. 5 stories, 130 years, and one cold fact. Here it is. Women don't break through in sports. They get let in. Every athlete, every sport, every moment is because a woman was let into the industry, to the world, to anything by someone else in power. I want you to think about Jackie Robinson for a second. He is widely recognized as the first Black baseball player in the modern major leagues. He broke the color barrier in 1947. Except here's the thing. Jackie Robinson wasn't the first Black baseball player, and he wasn't even the first Black baseball player who was great. There were players in the Negro leagues who were his equal or better. What made Jackie Robinson different wasn't his talent. It was the people who controlled Major League Baseball decided, in 1947, that he specifically was not a threat. Of course, he had the talent and the skills, and I don't want to downplay that. But he was chosen as much for his baseball acumen as he was because he was someone that would go along with the more uglier parts of the system. This was the inevitable racism, the hate speech, the physical threats from fans and even opposing teams. He was allowed in because he wouldn't fight back against that. Women's sports work the same way. And again, I don't want to downplay their skills and their training and their natural athletic ability because that all does absolutely come into factor. I am not by any means saying that women's sports and the athletes we talk about and see on the national stages are there purely because of someone controlling the puppet strings. They have absolutely earned their way in. But let's look at the examples. Lena Ratke wasn't let back into the Olympics in 1960 because the IOC finally acknowledged her 1928 world record. She was let back in because the cost of keeping women out of the middle distance running had become harder to justify than the cost of letting them run. Bobby Gibb wasn't recognized by the Boston Athletic Association because they looked back at the film and realized she'd been the fastest woman on the course for 3 straight years. She was recognized 30 years later because the organization needed to be on the right side of history once the history had already been written. The U.S. women's hockey team didn't get a living wage because USA Hockey had a change of heart about what the women were worth. They got it because the boycott made the reputational cost of saying no higher than the cost of saying yes. And even then, the NHL had to secretly fund the gap. Lindsey Vann didn't get to jump in the 2014 Olympics because the IOC finally read its own medical data from 2002. She got to jump because the optics of keeping the world record holder out of the Olympics became more expensive than letting her in. And Simone Biles, the most decorated gymnast alive in a sport built entirely around women, made less than 0.5% of her income from the sport itself because the people controlling the commercial pipeline decided where the money went, and they decided it didn't get to go back to her or any of the other athletes in the sport. That's the lie. Not that women can't compete. The evidence has always been there that they are more than able. The lie is that women's sports has moments. It doesn't. It gets granted them by committees, by governing bodies, by sponsors, by leagues, by people who control the gate. And here's the part that should make you a little uncomfortable. Like I said, women's sports is having a commercial moment right now. Revenues are up 340% since 2022. They have new broadcast deals, new stadiums, new franchises. But if the last 130 years tell us anything, the moment didn't arrive because anyone has had a change of heart. It's arrived because women's sports have become profitable. They become too big to ignore, too visible to suppress. That means the moment is real, and it is also really fragile. Math changes. Broadcast deals expire. Public attention moves. The way we consume sports changes. The organizations and governing bodies that are now opening the doors weren't, in most cases, even enthusiastic supporters even 10 years ago. They're just really good at math. So raising awareness of women's exclusion was always the easy part. The harder part, the part that requires sustained pressure, real money, and people willing to hold the line, is what forces the calculation to change. And the calculation has to keep being forced because there are still gatekeepers out there. The 30 or so women who make up the elite level of the women's Nordic combined, and in fact, all 200 women that compete in the sport, are among the best in the world at one of the most technically, mentally, and physically demanding winter sports on Earth. The IOC hasn't showed its hand on which way it will vote this summer, but rest assured, they are doing the same math they have always done. Is the cost of keeping the women out higher than letting them in? And here's the kicker. There are currently 106 members on the IOC. 46 of them, almost half, are women. The IOC has been actively working since 2013 to close the gender gap across its leadership. They heavily promoted that the 2024 Paris Olympic Games achieved athlete gender parity, meaning there was 50-50 representation between male and female athletes. And in 2021, the IOC gave itself 2 commitments to be achieved by 2024, one of which was, and I quote, to continue to lead by example and support the acceleration of women's meaningful representation in governance, leadership, and decision-making bodies in the Olympic movement. IOC President Thomas Bach has said that no organization or country can afford to leave the skills of 50% of the population behind. And yet, the same committee continually denies these women the opportunity to compete in the Olympic Games. Women like Tara Garrity-Moats, one of the top U.S. women in Nordic combined and the inaugural World Cup champion. She said that in 2020, at the peak of her career, agents came to her and told her directly, if your sport were in the Olympics, we could make you $1 million today. But it's not, so we can't. Women like Annika Malasinski, another top competitor in Nordic combined, and the sister of men's Nordic combined athlete Nicholas Malasinski. Nicholas trains alongside his sister. He completes the same exercises and training runs. He competed in these last 2026 games. She did not. Women like Alexa Brabek, who is literally one of the best female athletes in Nordic combined, period. Now, I think the door is going to open for this team. I really do. But I hope this episode has caused you to stop and think more critically about why. It's not because they just got good. They've always been at the top of their field. It's because the ones who hold the power may finally be ready to let them in. And the cost of keeping them out may finally be too high. That's all I've got for today. If you haven't listened to last week's episode with Alexa, go back and do it, or at least read the show notes to see all the ways you can support the Women's Nordic Combined team. I'll see you next week. Thanks for spending time with us in the middle. If today's story caught your attention, drop a subscribe, share the episode, follow us on social media, and remember, it ain't over till it's over.